Good morning and welcome to our webinar on electoral reform. I'm Terence Corrigan, Projects and Publications Manager at the Institute of Race Relations, meeting you here with IRR analyst Marius Roodt. Now, I think that we can agree that over the past year or so, many new things have unfolded in South Africa. We're in a situation that would have looked decidedly unlikely 2 years ago. But this has been paired with a lot of things remaining pretty much as they have always been. And one of those has been the perennial question of electoral reform. This is something that there has been a lot of debate around over the years, but with, I would say, a marked reluctance on the part of the authorities to address in any meaningful fashion. Well, taking up the challenge, Marius has looked into the issue at some length and has proposals for how South Africa can recast its electoral system to create something that delivers more accountability and more effective governance. With that, I'm going to hand over to Marius. He will take us through the report and a few of the findings, after which we welcome comments and questions, which we'll be fielding through the chat. And with that, Marius, over to you.
Thank you, Terence. Thank you to Terence. Thank you to everybody who's joining us today. So we've done this report on electoral reform. We have a couple of recommendations, but I'm just going to take you through it now. Sorry, let me just share my screen here. Sorry, just there we go. Let me know if you can see everything. Is it sharing?
Not yet.
And now?
No. Don't worry, Marius. Old cats like us struggle with these things.
It worked now.
Yeah, it did.
What are you seeing at the moment?
I'm just seeing the faces of two IRR analysts.
Okay. Well, I'll start so long and let me know if it starts sharing, because it seems to be working from my side. So I think StreamYard is sometimes a bit buggy, unfortunately. So I'll just take you through the historical context, take you to some public views in the electoral system, and considerations for a new electoral system. I'll also talk a little bit about the experience from abroad. What would a reformed electoral system look like? And then I'll take you through our recommendations. So the historical context is that we had a party list proportional representation system, which that's system we currently use. It's had some tweaks over the last 30 years, but it was chosen during the transition because of its very close link between overall electoral support and seats secured in legislatures. It was initially envisaged as being a transitional system and was not supposed to be a system used long-term in South Africa, but we've obviously had it pretty much for the last 30 years. It's got a number of advantages, as parties with relatively low levels of support secure representation in elections. This ensures that minorities are represented in a legislature. This is all kinds of minorities, not necessarily ethnic or racial minorities, also religious minorities, or just people with kind of minority views. I think a good example is looking at the current makeup of our parliament. We have quite a few parties with relatively low levels of support who are in parliament. For example, look at a party like Good or the PAC or United Africans Transformation. Each of those parties only has one seat with around about 0.2% of overall support, but they are represented, and it helps to ensure that a very large spread of views are heard in a legislature. There's also now, obviously, with the way that South Africa has become a coalition country, those kind of views are also even represented in governments, if you think about it. I mean, the sole PAC MP is also now a cabinet minister, and so is the sole Good MP. So, however, one of the problems with this party list proportional representation is that there's no link between communities and representatives. That's because you simply vote for a party. You don't vote for somebody to represent your local area. But there's been the need for electoral reform has been recognized for quite some time. It first came with the Van Styl-Slabbert Commission proposal. That was in the early 2000s. This suggested that South Africa should be broken up into about 70 constituencies. Each would elect between 3 and 7 MPs. In total, about 300 people would be elected from these constituencies, with another 100 elected from a parallel party list to ensure that there was still proportionality. This is a very solid report was released in 2003, I think it was, but was pretty much ignored by the government of the day, and it's been sitting gathering dust in some, forgotten office in the union buildings, I think. There was also the Motlanthe review. This was a review of post-apartheid legislation, and that also suggested that we need to have some kind of electoral reform where people are, at least some MPs are elected from geographical constituencies or from communities. The Zondo Commission also had a similar recommendation. They recommended that we need to have more direct elections of, say, the president, for example. This would go some way to ensuring that there'd be more accountability and so on. This obviously came in the wake of the Zuma years and all the chaos we saw there and the destruction of institutions. And there've been hold on. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Oh, sorry, I just got a call from our colleague. Apologies for this. Just having some technical difficulties.
Well, that's very much what technology is there for.
So I'm just quickly emailing this. There we go. Can we know if this is working now? Can you see anything, Terence?
Still the two of us.
Okay, and Bali's then going to help us with sharing from her side. But anyway, so we were talking about the Zondo Commission and how it's recommended some various recommendations for electoral reform and so on. There have been a number of other organizations that have also have come up with some proposals for electoral reform. Musiwa Lakota and Musima Mane had come with some proposals a couple of years ago, quite similar to the Van Styl-Slabbert Commission. The DA has also come up with a proposal, also pretty similar to the Van Styl-Slabbert Commission proposal, where we'd have multi-member constituencies, so you'd have more than one person elected from a constituency. But finally, we had to have South Africa had to start actually thinking about electoral reform in 2020, when we had a constitutional court ruling which compelled Parliament to amend the Electoral Act to allow independents to stand for the National Assembly and the 9 provincial legislatures. This was because a woman called Chantal Ravel, she came forward and said she wanted to stand for Parliament, but as it stood, you had to be a member of a political party to stand for Parliament or one of the 9 provincial legislatures. You couldn't just stand as an individual, and this hits against a couple of provisions in the Constitution, things such as a right of association. Right of association includes your right to not associate with people. So if you don't want to associate with a political party, that was one of the issues where what to allow independence and so on to stand. So an electoral reform panel was formed. So Mbali, we are in the historical context with the 2020 Constitutional Court ruling. I try and confirm that. Yes, there we go. So we had the electoral reform panel was obviously was formed to provide recommendations. We had the Electoral Act was amended, but the new electoral system, it's nonsensical, to be frank, and it follows the letter of the Constitutional Court ruling, but not its spirit. It basically bolts independence or individuals onto a party system, and it simply doesn't make sense. You can go to the just the next heading. Yes, independents are severely disadvantaged in this current system, and it really doesn't make sense. And what is actually quite shocking about this whole thing is that in the electoral reform panel, there were actually two views in it, and the majority view recommended that we have a wholesale reform of the electoral system, where half of MPs, or around about half, maybe 250, would be elected from geographical constituencies, and the rest would be elected from party lists to ensure proportionality. Unfortunately, the electoral reform panel went for the minority view, which was where we had this very minor reform that we had in the last election, which was all pretty confusing. And yeah, it's quite a nonsensical system, and unfortunately, it is one of the considerations to just continue with the system up until 2029. Bali, you can go to the next slide. So we have there are a number of one of the things that the institute did during this study was we also surveyed people about what they thought the electoral reform, what they would like from an electoral system. So one of the things is that over 2/3 of people agreed that there should be some sort of a threshold. And if you're not aware, a threshold is that to be elected to parliament, you need a certain minimum level of support. A lot of countries in the world have it, New Zealand and Germany. So you have to get a minimum level of 5% to be elected into parliament. Israel has a level of about 3.25%, I think. Turkey had a very high level at one stage of 10%, but this was used to keep people, especially Kurds, out of the Turkish parliament. You can go to the next one, Bali. 81% of people we surveyed want to be able to directly elect their MP. Can we go to the next one? About the same number want to be able to directly elect the presidents. And last one, 87% want to be able to recall MPs. So what happens when you recall an MP? This is something that's happening in the UK at the moment. If a certain minimum percentage of people in a constituency say that they're unhappy with their MP and they sign a petition for a by-election, then a by-election is triggered. This is if they're not happy with the way the MP is behaving or whatever the case is. So a couple of these already happen in the UK where these recall elections have been triggered. But as far as I'm aware, every time it has happened, the MP who is under sort of investigation, whatever the case is, has decided to resign before facing the voters in a by-election. But you can go to the next point, Mbali. There have been another number of other surveys that have had similar findings. There was one also conducted around about the same time as the Van Zyl-Slabbert report, had very similar findings to this. There have been other findings from other polling organizations such as Afrobarometer. They've all had very similar findings. It's clear that South Africans want to be able to directly elect their MPs. They want to have people who are accountable. So I think it's time we definitely have to start looking at how we can have this happen. Can you go next slide, Mbali? So when we come to considerations for a new electoral system, the only constitutional requirement is that any system must result in general in proportional representation. That means we actually have quite a few options. Some of the options that we've been looking at. Firstly, you could have single-member constituencies. You can go to the next point there, Mbali. You can have single-member constituencies with parallel party lists. There we go. So that would be basically the system that was recommended by the Electoral Reform Panel, and that's the system we have at local government level in South Africa. So that's where you have a number of MPs elected from geographical constituencies, and then you have a parallel party list which ensures that you have proportional representation. which, as you can see, is the one of the only requirements when it comes constitutionally from to have an electoral system. There's also the question of multi-member constituencies, which is what the Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission has proposed. And as I say, that's where you'd have one constituency, but you'd have, you know, a certain number of MPs. The Van Zyl-Slabbert Commission, they proposed between 3 and 7 members per constituency, obviously depending how many people live there. There's a couple of problems with that system. You basically have the issues that we have at national level. They just happen again in multi-member constituencies because it'll be very difficult for an individual to standing as an independent to run on a fair basis against people representing parties. You'd also have problems when you try to have by-elections and so on. So it's all, I don't know if it's the system that we do want, but it's something that a lot of people have been pushing for. And then finally, there's the single transferable vote. That's actually quite a good system. That's what they use in Ireland, for example. And that's where you can rank the various people you want to represent you. It's also actually a multi-member system, but it seems to work a bit better. You also it helps to get rid of some of the problems that you have with the multi-member constituency system. But it's quite a complex system, as you have to rank who you want to represent you in Parliament. It takes quite a long time to count and determine who's actually won and so on. And I think in a country like South Africa, it's probably not suitable, especially I think Ireland's obviously a very different country from South Africa, much smaller population, probably a bit better educated than South Africans. So it's something that we'd have to think about carefully, but I think it's probably not the system that we would want at the moment. And there's obviously the option of just continuing with the current system that we have, which I think there is probably some support for that within people who are looking at an electoral reform at the moment. So it's that's one thing we have to think about. And unfortunately, I don't think we should carry on with the current system, but we'll get to that in a bit. You can move to the next slide, Mbali. So the experience from abroad is that many countries around the world use some sort of mixed system, which is, as I've said, some MPs elected from geographic constituencies, other from parallel party lists. You can go to the next bullet point, Bali. Most of the countries will still use the old first past the post system, which is used in the UK, for example. It's still pretty common in the Anglosphere. But it's not as common as it used to be, and it's becoming quite common to use proportional representation in English-speaking countries. As I just mentioned, Ireland uses it, New Zealand uses it, Australia uses a form of it, Lesotho uses it, Namibia uses also a form of proportional representation. So yeah, it's something that we need to think about. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, the issue of thresholds, where political parties have to get a certain level of support to be elected to a legislature. A lot of countries use a threshold, but South Africa doesn't. And it's something we need to think about. Is it something to consider, or is it anti-democratic? We've definitely seen in a lot of municipalities where very small parties act as kingmakers, and they have quite high levels of they managed to become quite powerful, even if they have quite low levels of support. And we saw what happened in Johannesburg, where 2 people from the Al Jamaa party, which only had 3 seats out of 270 in Johannesburg, the 2 people from there were elected as mayor as the mayor of the city. We also had in Ekurhuleni, where somebody from a very small party was elected as mayor. Tshwane as well in Nelson Mandela Bay. So if we have some kind of threshold, that would stop that kind of thing happening. But it's also a question: is it anti-democratic? I think it's something we have to think about. And the fact of the matter is, South Africa does have an implicit threshold, because you obviously have to get to a certain level of support to make it into Parliament. But there's no explicit threshold, and there's something, it's something we have to consider. And I think if we did think of a threshold, it would have to be a very low threshold at around about 1%, lower than what other countries have used. You can go to the next slide, Mbali. So what would a mixed member system look like? Should we have a single member or multi-member system? How many MPs would be elected from geographical constituencies and how many elected from PR lists, proportional representation lists, and should consideration be given to expanding the number of MPs? I think that's something that people haven't really thought about, and I think it's something we do need to think about. There probably will be quite a lot of pushback because I don't think South Africans like to spend more money on government officials than they would than they do already. But we've had the same number of MPs since 1994, and in that year, South Africa had about 40 million people. Now it's grown. We've got over 60 million people now. So we need to perhaps think about expanding the number of MPs. I mean, the UK has 650 MPs, and they have a population only slightly bigger than South Africa's. So it's something to think about, and it would we would have to change the constitution for that. So it's obviously something you want to be quite careful about when you do consider this. But it's something I think we do need to give some thought to, and it's not something we should just dismiss out of hand, I don't think. Can we move to the next slide, Mbali? And finally, what would a mixed member system look like? So we did some modeling, or Mark Atkins, who's a elections analyst, did some modeling for us, and he looked at what would happen in a system where we had single member constituencies, how many seats each party would get in such a system. So as you can see, if we had a system with 200 seats and 200 top-up PR seats, the ANC would have got about 120 of the constituency seats, the DA 40, MK around about 36, 240, ANC would have got 148 of those seats, the DA 50. And as you can see, if we had a system where we had 300 directly elected seats and 100 top-up seats from a proportional representation system, the ANC would have got 177 seats, which is actually more seats than it won last year in the 2024 election. This is what's called an overhang, and that's what happens when a party wins more directly elected seats than it's actually entitled to from its overall share of the vote. So that's something we have to consider. Obviously, 300 directly elected seats is a bit much. I think 250 would be a better number, I think. So it's something we have to consider when we start looking at these kinds of reforms and so on. It's been a problem in Germany with overhang seats, and they've actually had to have some interventions to stop it. The German parliament, or the Bundestag, was actually getting so big because of overhang seats. I think it had nearly 800 members at one stage. But they've made some reforms now where they've limited the number of MPs in the Bundestag. Can you go to the next slide, Mbali? And this is what it would look like with in a multi-member constituency. So this is if we had more than one person elected from a constituency. You see it would be a little bit different. The ANC wouldn't do as well, which I think makes sense. It's quite something that you'd expect. But as I said, there's a couple of problems with a multi-member constituency. It has the same kind of problems you have at the national level with when you have individuals running against people who are standing for parties. I think you'd also have kind of split responsibilities where, if you have a constituency of, where there's 4 people standing, it'd be like when you do group projects at school or university. One person would probably do all the work, and there'd be a couple of people who just ride on their coattails. And I think this is probably what would happen if we had a multi-member constituency system. That's also something we need to consider. Mbali, can go to the next slide. And finally, we have a couple of recommendations. We need a system which is accountable, fair, and responsive. That's one of the most important things. And we believe the best system for that would be a single member constituency with a parallel proportional representation top-up. This would be similar to the system used at municipal level and in New Zealand and Germany, for example. So that's where you have a constituency just with one representative. People go vote for their candidates, and then you have a parallel list where you can also vote for parties and then people are also elected from that list to ensure that the results in the legislature reflect the results in the overall election. So we believe there's a number of reasons for this. We think it could change incentives. Small things can change incentives, and we think this could force parties to put forward higher caliber candidates. We also think this could go some way to helping solve the problem of declining voter turnout. That is actually becoming quite a big problem in South Africa. In 2024, we had the lowest ever voter turnout in a post-apartheid election. While the proportion of people of registered voters who turned out was not bad at about 66%, the proportion of eligible voters was much lower. A lot of people who can vote simply don't register to vote. So that's South Africans over the age of 18, and that's I think that could actually be an existential threat for South African democracy in the long run. The 2021 local government election was even worse, where only 30% of eligible voters turned out. So if people aren't seeing that the democratic process is a legitimate way of having their voices heard, people could turn to other ways, in which we've seen in South Africa, where we've seen violent protests and so on, where people feel that's the only way that they can really have the authorities listen to them, is by, engaging in violence and protests and so on. Obviously, we want people to feel that they can do that at the ballot box. I mean, that's what we want to have in a democracy like ours. And also, one of the things, as I mentioned, then you don't have the split responsibility. That could be a case in a multi-member system. And also when it comes to things such as the possibility of having by-elections, these are difficult in a multi-member system. So for those reasons, we think we should we should have a single member constituency system with a parallel PR top-up, probably with around about 250 directly elected seats and then 150 elected from a parallel proportional representation list. And that's what we recommend at the moment. We also think that you can go to the next bullet point there, Mbali. We also don't think the president should be directly elected. This is unsuitable for a country like South Africa, where national coalitions are likely to govern in the future. We don't think it's a good idea to have a president elected in kind of a winner-takes-all system. I think a good example of where the problems with that is what's actually happening in the United States now. Donald Trump obviously won the election last year, but he won it with just under 50% of the overall vote, and he's upending the global trade system and so on. And he was actually fewer than 50% of Americans actually voted for him. So we think it's better to have a system where we have a president who's overseen by Parliament, and that's likely, as I say, to be something that's with coalitions are going to be governing in the future. People who study like comparative democracy and so on, they also the findings generally seem to be that in the presidential systems, the satisfaction with democracy is a bit lower than in parliamentary systems. There's obviously a whole heap of reasons for that. But one of those could be because there needs to be less consensus and so on in a presidential system. So that's something why we think we shouldn't be directly electing the president. And then you can go to the final bullet point, Mali. And we also think that recall petitions should be avoided when it comes to MPs and so on. From speaking to a number of people, the recall petitions have there's probably quite a lot of opportunity for them to be abused by people. You'd have an MP who's maybe fairly popular in his constituency, but there'd be a faction in his party wants to get rid of him, and they can kind of weaponize recall petitions. It could just cause quite a lot of chaos. So we think that's one reason to avoid recall petitions. But that's it's definitely a way of increasing accountability. But we think it's not the optimal way, and as I say, I think can probably be weaponized for the wrong reasons. And you can go to the final slide, Mbali. But in the final analysis, it's up to South Africans to ensure that our democracy works. We can do as much electoral reform as we want. We can make, the greatest system that's ever been invented in the history of humanity. But it's up to South Africans to get involved, get engaged, and it's also up to our political parties actually to start becoming a bit more, I think, a bit more mature. I think we've seen, as I mentioned, Johannesburg earlier. That was clearly a case of where political parties weren't doing what's best for the people of the city. They were doing what is best for themselves. And it's up to voters to punish those parties, but also, I suppose, up to those political parties to actually start putting voters first, I think. But the only way there has to be if they get punished at the ballot box, then behavior will change, I think. And as the Minister of Home Affairs said, it's up to voters to do the heavy lifting on this kind of thing. We can't just rely on the people who write policy and so on. And yeah, those you can go to the final slide, Mbali. Yeah, and thank you for everybody who listened and made it through. And those are our recommendations. And me and Terence would be happy to take any questions that you have.
Well, thanks, Marius. I think what I took away from this, the sort of macro, particularly your last point, is that a lot of this really comes down to the conduct of politics that transcends the institutional design. And I think that we do have a somewhat unfortunate habit in South Africa of latching on to the latest trendy cause, whether it's electoral reform or it's whistleblower protection. And, if only we could, get the right laws on this, it's going to be an absolute game changer. And then we're very surprised when it's business as usual. Now, our audience has been attentive and participatory, I suppose, in line with the theme of the day's proceedings. So we already have a list of questions lined up, some of which we can deal with, some of which may be more difficult. Let me start with the first one. I understand the ANC and DA are putting forward legislation to create a minimum percentage of votes secured to enable both provincial and parliamentary representatives. Is there progress in this regard?
Yeah, so that's the thresholds I was speaking about. So as I understand it, at the moment, nothing's been spoken. No thresholds have been proposed for provincial or national elections, but there has been thresholds proposed for local government elections. So as it stands, I think the consensus is kind of around about 1%. But there's obviously a lot of pushback from that. For that from smaller parties. And I think it might be pretty difficult for the ANC and the DA to pass. Obviously, they don't really have to worry about these low thresholds, but smaller parties, especially ones that's, always there and thereabouts, kind of your Freedom Front Pluses or ACDP or PA or whatever where they, sometimes get below 1%, sometimes above, depending what the area is. They're obviously going to be, there'll be a lot of pushback against that. As I say, that's something we have to think about. Is it anti-democratic to have some kind of threshold? But in any electoral system, there's going to be trade-offs. And I think deciding to have thresholds is one of those. Having a threshold can also lead to some democratic consolidation. Say if the ACDP was never getting above 1%, you'd probably see a lot of its members decide to, decamp to another party, whichever one that may be, or Freedom Front Plus, or whatever the case is. So there's always going to be some trade-offs, and I'm gonna say I'm not too sure how I feel about thresholds. I think there has to be, they have caused some instability, these smaller parties in our politics. But as somebody said, the guys from Al Jamaa, for example, who those two guys who became the mayor of Johannesburg, they didn't just vote for themselves. They were voted in because big parties like the ANC and the EFF voted for them. They were the ones who actually causing the instability. So we have to also be careful about blaming small parties, I think, for a lot of this instability and chaos. A lot of it actually comes from our larger parties who don't really have to worry about thresholds.
Sure. Look, and I think that there is also a question of political culture there, because I imagine that the big driver in Johannesburg was that the ANC and the DA simply were not interested in trying to find ground. Of course, it does raise the counter question: are you willing to perhaps deny certain very niche and perhaps fringe voices an institutional platform, and then do you perhaps send them off to look for other ways to express themselves? As you say, I know in Germany the 5% threshold was to a large extent to ensure that extremists were kept out, and that was okay until you find a situation where there is such dissatisfaction with the established parties that you now have one of these outsiders that's made its way in. The phenomenon of cartelization, where the same incumbents manage to simply circulate things amongst themselves. Next question: how many members of civil society? How many members of civil society can be co-opted or included as part of parliamentary representation? My sense is none.
Well, I think anybody, I mean, before an election, I think a political party could approach, members and say, would you like to stand on our ticket or whatever the case is? And then you could stand as a representative for political party. But I think once the lists have been, what do you call it, mm, being given to the IEC or your candidates, whatever the case is, then I think that's it. But I mean, that's only to a certain degree. I think we've seen what's happened with the MK party. They've basically recycled the entire parliamentary caucus, and I think they haven't had much. They haven't really thought about who was on their parliamentary list before the election. They just, it's kind of becoming a patronage system for people who supported our former president, I think. But I mean, I think people being co-opted by members of civil society be co-opted, it's always a good idea. You get, broader views and so on. And I think that's, I mean, just to go off on a bit of a tangent, I think that's actually maybe a problem in South Africa, that only two people who aren't members of parliament can become members of cabinet. I think even though there's 400 MPs, I think sometimes it can be a bit of a shallow talent pool, and it's something we should maybe look at, is being able to co-opt more people from outside of Parliament into cabinet. There's obviously a lot of people who are very talented and who care a lot about South Africa, who aren't MPs and who do pretty good jobs as cabinet ministers. There's obviously a lot of people who aren't MPs and don't care about South Africa, who do very bad jobs as cabinet ministers and could get appointed to cabinet. But yeah, I think it's something we also there's lots of innovative ways I think we can look to try to change how South Africa works and how South Africa's governed, I think.
Look, I'd just like to throw something on top of that. That a democratic forum is, well, the theory is that it is elected. Co-opting is in some ways a very undemocratic way of doing things. Now, there again, you may be trying to trade off democratic representation for, some sort of societal goal. But it shouldn't be lost sight of that is a trade-off. I would also say that there is a risk here in that in countries that do this, like I think Zimbabwe and Rwanda, you co-opt members in, and they often function as an extension of the ruling bloc. So in Rwanda, they have mandatory seats for women, but these invariably tend not to represent women, but tend to represent the dominant faction. South Africa, I think, actually has something analogous in the sense of the House of Traditional Leaders. Then we have.
I mean, but there's a House of Traditional Leaders in the UK, right? The House of Lords. So
there is indeed. We need fewer MPs, not more. The taxpayer foots the salary bill. And I believe the next comment is a reference to this. Hopefully you'll be allowed to do this. As for me, I see colonial fingers in the pie here in South Africa. So good luck, which I imagine the fingers in the pie refer to the salary pie. And then quality versus quantity, quality over useless junkies. Marius, anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, that's all fair enough. But I think, as I said, it all comes down to political culture. And I think if we, these single member constituencies, as I said, it could force political parties to have high caliber candidates. You'd have to have guys who are actually going around and pressing the flesh and being on the hustings, and not just guys who put in on a party list and then get elected to parliament or whatever the case is. And yeah, there's definitely a case to be made that we need fewer MPs, but the work, I mean, if an MP is doing their job properly, there's a lot of work, and reducing that number, I think we actually have to be quite careful about it. And when it comes down to it, even if we increase the number of MPs by say 200, whatever the case is, there'll be a lot of extra money in salaries and so on. But actually, that extra money overall is a drop in the ocean in what South Africa spends. Actually, there's other places we should be cutting, the fat and so on. I mean, there's it's obviously not a link to this, but I mean, there's a story today that there's 13 municipal-owned entities in the city of Johannesburg. Each of them has an CEO earns 2 million rand, or whatever the cases. They each have a board. They each have executive management teams, which are then like 5 or 6 people also earning 1 million rand, 1.5 million rand a year. That's where we actually need to start cutting the fat. And I think with something like we need to make parliaments an important institution again. It needs to be somewhere where people want to go and where good work does happen. I think the fact that the ANC has lost its majority could maybe go some way to doing that. It won't be the rubber stamp that it used to be. I think that we saw that happen with the recent budget debates. In the past, the ANC would have just said, well, we're making VAT 30%. If you don't like it, sorry for you. But now, obviously, they couldn't do it. They couldn't even raise it by 2 points because it's coalition partners and other parties outside the GNU push back against it, and it's made Parliament a site of proper political contestation again, which I think is very important actually, and it's good for South Africa overall.
Next one, I think, is a comment rather than a question. My 2 cents worth in minimum thresholds. Although I get the idea of trying to prevent kingmakers, it also prevents the change makers' voice from being heard. A case in point is Helen Suzman, who was a lone Liberal voice for many years, as the only woman in Parliament calling for the free South Africa we have today. Without her in Parliament at the time, South Africa would likely not be the South Africa we have and share today. With the threshold, she would not have made it to Parliament. One could actually probably expand that a little bit and say that depending on where your threshold was, if it was at a high but sort of middle ranging 2% in 1994, the Democratic Party wouldn't have made it into Parliament, and it's unlikely we would have the Democratic Alliance. Love it or hate it, would exist today. Don't know if you have any comments on that.
I think with Helen Suzman, it's a little bit different because in those days, South Africa used the first past the post system. So you didn't have to, wasn't proportional representation. Helen Suzman was elected because she famously won her Houghton constituency, I think, for 13 years. She was the only progressive MP in Parliament. But I get the point that's been made here. And I take it, and that's why I said it's something we have to consider. Even if you look at somebody like what's her name, Patricia de Lille, whatever you think about her now, she did a lot of work to raise issues around the arms deal in the 1990s and early 2000s, and she was a member then of the PAC, which was a very small party, and she was basically thanks to her, I think, that we heard about. She uncovered a lot of the arms deal corruption. So yeah, as I said, it's not something I'm wedded to. It's something we need to think about. And as I said, the issue of these small parties rising to the top in places like Johannesburg wasn't because of the small parties. It was because of big parties like the ANC and the EFF who voted for them. Same as the people from small parties who got elected in Ekurhuleni and Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay. They can't vote for themselves in because they literally only have 3 or 4 seats in the city council. It was because of big parties voting for them for various reasons, probably because then they're easier to control or whatever the case is. So, as I say, threshold is just something we need to think about. I'm not saying it's something we definitely have to implement. And as I say, there's an argument to be made that it's anti-democratic to even have thresholds.
Sure. Is there any discussion on the CVs of candidates, like having no criminal record, the level of education, or anything like that? Is that a question that's even on the table at the moment?
As far as I understand, if you have up to a certain level of criminality, you can't become an MP. I think if you've been sentenced to jail if you're sentenced to something that's sent you to jail for more than a year, I think. But I also think we must be careful about saying, education levels and so on. It's kind of, it's elitist. Just because somebody's got a PhD from Harvard doesn't mean that they care more about the country or going to be more hardworking than somebody who's actually, from whatever, rural KwaZulu-Natal and only managed to get a standard 6. Of course, I think education is obviously important, and I think ongoing education is important, and I think MPs should go on courses so they can understand this complex legislation and so on. But I think we need to be very careful about saying that MPs have to have a minimum level of education. I think it's an elitist way often of keeping people out. And some of the stupidest people I've ever met have had PhDs, and some of the smartest people I've met didn't finish school. So, I think having a certain level of education doesn't mean you're going to care more, be more hardworking, or even be more intelligent than somebody who's got a high level of education. But also what it comes down to is it's up to parties have to put forward good candidates, and then the voters have to look at these candidates and decide if they're going to vote for them. If there's somebody with a criminal record and a party puts them forward, you have the choice to not vote for that person. If you still want to vote for the person or you support the party no matter what, then that's on the voters, unfortunately. And I think also comes down to political culture. We need to, I think voters need to insist that we want people are very high caliber representing them in parliament and in provincial legislatures and in municipal councils. Because I think, while I think a lot of public representatives are very hardworking and do care about the country, there's also a large number who don't, and who often they're just who become a politician because it's a good meal ticket.
Mm. Yeah, look, I think that in as far as making education or life achievement or whatever a precondition, that would strike very much at the heart of democratic citizenship. Um, some people simply didn't have the opportunity. Um, I think, though, that when somebody has that argument perhaps doesn't hold when you're talking about somebody who has broken the social contract. Although you can say, well, if that person has served a sentence, then as you say, it becomes something that free people should be able to deliberate about.
Exactly.
The next, what about critical issues, representatives such as environmental promotion, good race relations advocates, gender advocates, etc.? I think this essentially comes back to the question of civil society being co-opted. I think the point there is that it's really up to parties to make those offerings.
Exactly, and also if somebody feels strongly about it, say they're somebody who's a big environmentalist, they can join a political party and make it lobby for it to become a big issue in that political party or whatever the case is, or on around gender issues or whatever you. And it comes down to who people want to vote for. I mean, would a Green Party do well in South Africa? Like, I'm not too sure. I mean, I think since
We've
1994,
had
there's only
attempts.
been we've had attempts at it, and they've never really done. I mean, I think the best ever did was a party called the Eco Peace eThekwini, I think, which won a couple of seats in Durban in about 15 or 20 years ago. And like I think I know this is really reducing it to much less than it is, but jobs are polar bears, and I think when it comes down to it, a lot of South Africans are still going to choose jobs over the polar bears. And of course, environmental issues are important. It's not something we can pretend it's and just because we're a country with lots of other issues that we can forget about, things like environmentalism. But I think a lot of people those kind of issues will be on the back burner. It's when we have a country where there's unemployment of 10%, then I think maybe environmental issues and so on will become a bit more important. But unfortunately, I think South Africa and people face a lot of existential crises, things around work and employment and how much money the country has and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that it's important to know that note that Zaki Ahmed tried to stand as an independent, and if there's anybody in South Africa with kind of a brand name recognition and with those sort of credentials and that type of popularity, and that was a bit of a damn squib. So yeah, look, I think also people tend to vote on party identification. That's simply a.
But I think that also shows you how independents were disadvantaged. I think if we had much more, if we had actual constituencies, Ahmad could maybe have stood in, community where he's well known, perhaps where he's from, and he maybe would have done a bit better. As a stood, he was running as an independent for the National Assembly, but having to stand against political parties, and across the whole country. It simply didn't make sense for independents to be bolted onto our current system. And Zaki Ahmed actually didn't do too badly. He wasn't actually too far off actually getting elected to Parliament. So yeah, as I say, if he'd been able to stand in a much smaller constituency, maybe would have had a chance to actually be elected. And but that all said, independents generally fare poorly around the world. I think in Ireland, in their last election, about 10% of people who elected were independents, which is pretty high. But most of the time, if you look in the UK, very rarely do independents get elected. In most countries around the world, independents very rarely get elected, and when they do, they often don't last more than one term, whatever the case is, because they don't have the support of a political party, they don't have caucus support, they don't have finances to support them with research and traveling around their constituency and getting to speaking to the voters and so on. So while independents are, I think they are a good addition to politics. I don't think they are silver bullets. Overall, that all said, also just look at how many independents get elected in our local government elections, where we do have single member constituencies effectively. It's very rarely, and also very rarely does an independent last longer than one term. They often get co-opted by one of the big parties, or they decide, this isn't really for them. I mean, there was in the last election, last round of by-elections, the ANC actually won an award off an independence in the Eastern Cape. The fellow had won the award in 2021, and he was actually he was removed as ward councillor by the MEC in Eastern Cape. But anyway, and then the ANC went and won that award. So yeah, independence, they find it tough. I think it's quite a hard thing to do.
Yeah. Well, look, in South Africa's own history, if you go back to pre-94, independents were a vanishingly rare breed. There were in 1987 there was a great deal of excitement about three former National Party members, Dennis Worrell, Esther Latachan, and Vanna Milan. And despite the fact that the Progressive Party didn't contest those constituencies, was broadly sympathetic to them, only one of them actually made it. So, if not recall, how to ensure accountability?
I think that comes down to also political culture and political parties, putting up high caliber candidates, and then also the accountability comes in the next election. That's when you hold people accountable. The next election, the ballot box. This guy was a terrible MP, whatever the case is, or she stole, or whatever the case is. Like, well, I'm not going to vote for them again. I'm going to vote for somebody else, and make sure the party knows that I'm pissed off about it. And also, there's other ways. I mean, I think if we have MPs from geographical constituencies, if you have an MP from whatever, Alexandra, whatever the case is, you could lobby the guy, there's been no water here. Well, I mean, I think Alexandra is actually a good example, because if we think back to in the lockdown when Collins Khoza was murdered by the security forces for having a beer in his yard. Imagine now the kind of lobbying if we had an MP who represented Alexandra, and people from Collins Khoza's community was writing to that MP all the time and saying, what are you doing to bring Collins Khoza's killers to justice? And if that guy stood up every time in Parliament and said, Mr. President, what is happening with the people who killed Collins Khoza? And I think that's where having a geographically elected MP could be quite powerful. Somebody who really stands up for local issues and can raise them and say, whether it's something terrible like what happened to Collins Khoza, or just where, the community is not having water. We always talk about, how terrible it is that the various places in Joburg don't have water, in Ekurhuleni, which is all, I mean, it is terrible. I live in Ekurhuleni, but there have been places in South Africa who've had day zero for 10 years. They haven't had taps have been dry for years. Nobody cares because they're small places. Nobody really goes there. They're not Joburg or Durban or Cape Town or whatever the case is. But if you have an MP who's elected from there, can raise these issues, and he's on TV in Parliament saying, look, what's happening? These people haven't had running water for 10 years. When we're going to sort this out? Or he can be, be in the newspaper or on a news site or whatever the case is. So, but I think what it also, as I say, it comes down to political culture in South Africa. If you're not happy with somebody, then you have to vote for a different party. Often in South Africa, and I mean, it's not just South Africa, I think political parties are treated more as religious bodies than political parties. To leave a political party, not just ANC, a lot of political parties, I think if you leave it, you're an apostate. You're not just somebody who's changed your mind maybe on things or doesn't like the party anymore. You're somebody who's actually, it's been an affront to, the divine almost.
All right. Okay. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. Most of what I see here are comments, so I'm just going to breeze through them, and then I'll ask Marius to give a sort of comprehensive closing remark. CV's history and track record of people are very important. It's all very well to propose electoral reform, but what will it take to make it happen? Turkeys do not vote for Christmas. And rules of the game versus rules of the game and guiding principles. I imagine that refers to refers to the prospects for electoral reform. The big parties are inclined to cause more harm than decent and small parties led by the likes of Musi, Songezo, etc. Is there a place for an upper house for those concerned South Africans? I think the upper house would be those eminent persons. Though I would say that after the howls of derision that have greeted the national dialogue, I'm not sure that would really be an idea that many people want to endorse. Democracy might yield perverse outcomes. And then also co-opted members of society might enhance the quality and legitimacy of parliamentary politics. Who decides on what cabinet ministries are required? I think that's up to the president, essentially. And then common sense could beat education. What values are designed for public representatives? So here's, I think, is a substantive comment. What should there be consideration given to retirement age for politicians? Where do you think voter apathy comes from? And I think I'm going to leave it there, just on the just purely a question of time. I want to thank everyone for the wonderful comments. Marius, do you want to take a stab at those final that final list of comments, questions? Retirement age.
Yeah, I think retirement age. I think also that it comes down to voters can decide if they want to vote for, geriatrics. I think that's been a problem in the US, especially. There's lots of people who are pretty old, especially in the Senate and so on. But like that also comes down to political culture, I think. And I mean, it's a good question because I mean, most companies say you have to retire at 60 or 65, but you have people. I mean, it's what happened in the US now. People in their late 70s, early 80s, being president there. And I mean, I think being president in the US is probably quite a hard job. I don't think it's just like sitting in your armchair watching daytime TV or whatever the case is. Yeah, so there's maybe something to be thought about, but then also I think it's up to voters to decide if they don't want to vote for old people, they don't have to. So they can, but also there's this obsession with youth, I think, which is also sometimes maybe also a bit incorrect. I think, I mean, it's in the sweet spot for people like me and Terence, in your mid 40s to mid 50s, then that's really the intelligent people in society.
You're saying that because I'm geriatric.
And yeah. And then overall, yeah, I think. Sorry, what was the other question when it came to retirement age?
Well, there's a question of giving attention to a retirement age, and where do you think the voter apathy comes from?
I think that voter apathy just comes from people who feel that they're not really seeing any change at the ballot box, and there are other ways to make their voices heard. Unfortunately, this is not just a problem in South Africa. You see voter apathy around the world. Fewer and fewer people are voting. And I think that's got some serious problems for, as I say, the actual long-term legitimacy and survival of democracy. The government needs the consent of the governed. And even if it's a democratic society where people can go vote and make their voice heard, if they feel it's pointless and fewer people are voting, then are they still going to be consenting to be governed? There's some serious issues we have to think about. And as I said, in the last local government election, only 30% of eligible South Africans voted. That is actually quite a scary statistic. More than 2/3 of South Africans didn't bother to go vote. And, local government is in some ways more important than national and provincial government. But people didn't feel that there was any point to go do it. So, but yeah, overall, I think that this is a real golden opportunity for proper electoral reform. I think there's a lot of momentum for it, but I do think there is also there are some people who want to keep the current system. This very weird, half-baked, proportional representation system we have, which worked fine actually until they decided to try put individuals and independents alongside political parties. Simply doesn't make sense. It's completely nonsensical. But yeah, and as I say, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can look what New Zealand and Germany have done, or the system we use at local government level. It works fairly well, and I think that's what we have to start looking at. But as I say as well, electoral reform is not a silver bullet. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to South Africans and South African voters who, it's a bit of a cliche and a bit lame, but the future's in our hands. It literally is. The only people who can really change this stuff and lobby for this kind of thing is voters. And we really have to push hard for electoral reform. But I do think we have a good opportunity here. But if we don't reform the system properly, then I think that's another generation. It'll be another 20 or 30 years before we really have an opportunity. When we had the good opportunity in the early 2000s with the Van Staal-Slabbert report, we missed that opportunity. And we dare not let this opportunity slip.
Yeah. Look, if I can just add that there is, I think what we maybe need to go back to is the understanding of democracy, and to remember that there are powerful interests in South Africa's country and in South Africa's political firmament, for whom democracy effectively meant the right of our faction to rule. I'm old enough to remember the 1980s and what people's power meant. It didn't necessarily mean a pluralistic society. Whether South Africa post-apartheid would even have a multi-party system was one of those issues up for debate. The power of the people was going to be expressed through the movement. And there is a story which may be apocryphal, but is nonetheless, I think, revealing that when the Slubbert Commission came out and proposed change and proposed a system that would introduce accountability or redirect it from party bosses towards constituencies, Kader Asmal, who was a leading theoretician and intellectual and sort of moral voice in the ANC, demanded that it be filed in the dustbin. Now that shows, how far, how far we were. So this is an opportunity that needs to be taken up, but far more is required. With that, I'd like to thank Marius for his excellent work on this and for fielding the questions. I'd like to thank all of you for having attended. The report is available on our website, irr.org.za. Go to Occasional Papers, and we encourage you to share this video and to have a look at the report, its proposals in more detail, and by all means share it with your networks. And with that, I bid you good morning and a wonderful day further.